everybody, welcome back to my channel, The Francophile Reader. And welcome back to our read-along of Notre-Dame de Paris by Victor Hugo. After this video, there will be 2 other videos till we have finished this novel. So today I haven't had as much to talk about as I did in my previous videos, but I do primarily want to talk about the justice system because it features so heavily in this work. But first I want to talk about desire. Desire is this all-consuming passion in Notre-Dame de Paris. In Claude Frollo, who is madly in love with La Esmeralda. And he's madly in love, the emphasis being on madly, because it's responsible for everything. Even the attempted killing of Phoebus. He has become a monster because of his desire for La Esmeralda. And it's of course an unrequited love for several reasons. First, because he's a priest and he's not allowed to be in love. Second, because La Esmeralda, being an Egyptian, right, I don't want to use the word Roma, she is an Egyptian and therefore she's associated with witchcraft and Satan. So of course him being a good Christian is not allowed to be with La Esmeralda. And finally, because she just doesn't love him, she prefers Phoebus. And Frollo is so in love with La Esmeralda that he'd prefer to execute her rather than to let her be free and to love the person she wants to love. And then we have Champfleury, who is this recluse, whose story we encountered earlier when people were talking about her. There were these 3 women, if you recall, who were telling the story of Champfleury, who had a daughter, and her daughter was allegedly eaten by some Egyptian women. And now Champfleury has become a hermit, and in her cell she's constantly praying for justice and for revenge. So she's very happy when La Esmeralda is arrested and condemned for having allegedly killed Phoebus, and now that she's going to be executed, Champfleury feels like justice has been done. Up until, of course, Quasimodo claims right of asylum, snatches La Esmeralda away from the gallows, and saves her life, without Frollo knowing, and then Frollo having to come to terms with the reality that La Esmeralda has not been executed, and therefore the temptation is still there. Of course, there's this image of the woman as a temptress. Frollo feeling like Esmeralda has bewitched him, that he is not in control of his own desires. So I think desire is a really major theme in this work. There is also this theme of memory. Quasimodo saves La Esmeralda's life because she showed him compassion when he was in the grips of the justice system, when he was being punished. She was the only person who gave him anything to drink out of compassion and not to mock him like the other people. But like I said, I want to primarily focus on the justice system in the 15th and 16th centuries. So this novel takes place in 1482. So this is actually closer to the period that I study, which is the 16th century. And I've never really talked about my research interests before. I have my qualifying exams at the end of August, so I haven't begun my dissertation yet, but I'm interested in looking at trials and looking at martyrologies. So I'm interested in the rhetoric of the justice system in France in the early modern period. One of the things that is described in Notre-Dame de Paris is the amende honorable. So La Esmeralda has to undergo an amende honorable before she is executed. So the amende honorable was a practice throughout the Middle Ages and well into the early modern period, where the criminal, after being condemned and about to be executed, is paraded around town in a tumbrel, which is a cart. They're dressed in a white loose shirt. If they're a woman, the hair is cut short, and there is a noose, like a rope around the neck to symbolize the noose. They are made to hold a candle that they process to the place where they do their penance. They have to kneel and they have to ask forgiveness of God, of the king, and of the country. So La Esmeralda, despite the fact that she's not Christian, has to undergo this amende honorable, especially because she's not Christian. she perhaps has a lot more that she needs to ask forgiveness for. She is accused of sorcery, which is certainly a capital crime. However, she is not burned to the stake, which is really interesting because often people who were accused of heresy would be burnt at the stake. But she's not really a heretic, she's a special case. It is worth pointing out that it is actually in the early modern period, and not in the Middle Ages, that witchcraft becomes such a big deal. So all of these witch trials, that's the 16th century, also known as the Renaissance. There were witch trials in the Middle Ages, but they really increased in the 16th century and in the 17th century. So witch trials become even more common in 1482 when this story takes place. If you're interested in more about the penance rituals leading up to execution, I highly recommend this book, Seeing Justice Done, The Age of Spectacular Capital Punishment in France by Paul Friedland. This is all about capital punishment and how in the early modern period, capital punishment was a spectacle. It was theatrical. People would actually go to executions to have an experience of penance, collective penance, but also feeling like justice was actually done by witnessing the execution of someone. If you're interested in knowing the kinds of things that were done before someone was finally executed, and if you have a strong stomach, I recommend you going on Wikipedia and looking up what happened to the Catholic who assassinated Henry IV of Navarre, because he committed, of course, the gravest of crimes, the crime of lèse-majesté, which is the crime against the king, and because the king also has a spiritual authority as the most Christian king, because the king of France is considered le roi très chrétien, the most Christian king. When you assassinate the king, you're also attacking God. So you've attacked God and king, your punishment is the worst. So if you want to know the kinds of things that happened before the eyes of hundreds of people, check out some of these stories on Wikipedia. I know that Michel Foucault has a book called Discipline and Punish. Paul Friedland takes some of these stories, but he really challenges Foucault's thesis. And actually, in many ways, that book is dated. So I would recommend Seeing Justice Done instead if you're interested in the theatricality of punishment. But actually, Esmeralda doesn't face too much. I mean, she is tortured, and torture was for interrogation purposes. I know we sometimes use the word torture to talk about just pain inflicted on someone, but torture is interrogation. So it is pain inflicted on someone so that they may confess certain things. Here, Esmeralda really doesn't have, she can't say anything to prove her innocence because everything is stacked against her. The final thing that we see in this work is right of asylum. The right of asylum existed, again, throughout the Middle Ages. It really does disappear in the early modern period, or it transfers in other ways. So we still have rights of asylum, but not in churches or ecclesiastical institutions. But the right of asylum came out of the Council of Orleans in 511, and it was decided that the home of a bishop or church, so a parish or any kind of church building could be claimed by a person as asylum, and they could be then protected from being pursued by the law. And usually, right of asylum was respected. There were cases when it wasn't respected, when the parliament would try to bypass the church's authority, but because the church and the parliament are often hand in glove, that didn't always, the right of asylum was generally respected. And so Quasimodo knows this, and so he claims right of asylum after he essentially kidnaps, but really saves La Esmeralda from execution. And so in a way, Quasimodo knows the law. He really is aware of what the law permits, and he uses it to protect La Esmeralda. I think it's interesting because while Hugo presents the justice system as really broken in the late 15th century, he also shows how people might manipulate what the law allows to protect themselves from execution or any kind of punishment. The execution occurs at the Place de Grève, which today is the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville I believe I have a picture of that because I was in Paris for 3 days a few months ago before quarantining began, and I will put a picture here. But returning to people using the possibilities of the law to minimize their sentence, I want to talk about letters of remission. Now, letters of remission are not discussed in this novel, but they really go with this theme. So, beginning in the 14th century, letters of remission become more common, and they are probably the most common in the early 16th century. So maybe a little bit after this story takes place. Natalie Zemon Davis has written a book called Fiction in the Archives, where she talks about the literariness of these letters of remission. So what happens is that the king reserved the right to adjudicate cases and to overturn the parliament's decisions. Because the king was ultimately the king, he had the final say. Now, there is no absolute monarchy in France yet. However, the kings do at times oppose the decisions of the parliament because ultimately they want to have all the power. You see these attempts at having more and more power, beginning, for example, in the 16th century with Francis I. So, this comes from an encyclopedia. I will put the information below, but this is what it says. In this period, too, appeared what was afterwards called justice retenue. That is to say, the justice which the king administered or was supposed to administer in person. It was based on the idea that since all justice and all judicial power reside in the king, he could not deprive himself of them by delegating their exercise to his officers and to the feudal lords. Consequently, he could, if he thought fit, take the place of the judges and call up a case before his own council, end quote. And so what would happen is criminals would have the option to appeal to the king, but they need to convince the king that they are innocent. And so they would produce letters of remission. Now, many of these people don't know how to write, okay? They might be able to read, even Latin. There were peasants who could read Latin, but they are not necessarily going to be able to write. So they have these scribes who will write their story. Now, if you're trying to convince the king, you better tell a good story. And so what Natalie Zemon Davis shows is that these letters of remission are really quite entertaining and really rhetorically rich. They are worth studying from a literary perspective. Natalie Zemon Davis is kind of the forerunners of the law and literature movement that focuses on the literariness of legal documents. Because who would expect a legal document to be literary? And yet that's precisely what she argues. These people would have to tell their stories in such a way that they could hope to get the forgiveness of the king. Maybe minimize their punishment, at least avoid execution. We don't see the king stepping in any way in the case of La Esmeralda. Despite the fact that, it is a capital case, there are no appeals made to the king. Here, the procureur du roi, who is the attorney for the king, and who is also responsible for making sure that the law is applied properly, he is the one who takes care of the case. And actually, in most cases, it would be the procureur du roi who represents the king. But I just want to point out that this aspect exists and that it really intersects with the study of literature. This is particularly interesting to me because I study essentially nonfiction, even as a literature student. So the big point of this video is to show that there really is a structure to the justice system in the 16th century and in the late 15th, where the story takes place. Not that there aren't things that we might object to, but I do think it's important to think about how the system is structured, how people try to work within that system. We see this with Quasimodo, who claims right of asylum for La Esmeralda. And ultimately, that the Middle Ages, is not the most barbaric when it comes to justice. 16th, 17th centuries witnessed some really horrible punishments for crime. There were often three branches of the justice system. There was the king, there was the parliament, and then in the 16th century, especially for religious cases, you get the Faculty of Theology of the University of Paris. The Faculty of Theology has no right to execute anybody. The church, technically, doesn't execute anybody. What the church does is condemn the person for heresy, and particularly the case of recidivism, which means you repented of your heresy and then you went back to your heresy. After having condemned that individual, they are then transferred to the secular arm, which is the parliament. But of course, the parliament is also hand in glove with the Faculty of Theology, and so they generally agree about how the case should be dealt with. It is therefore then up to the king to decide whether he will intervene. Natalie Zeman Davis has written a lot about Marguerite de Navarre, who was the sister of King Francis I, and she drew up several letters of remission for people, particularly evangelical humanists, whom she defended because she herself was an evangelical humanist. If you're interested in French literature from a historical perspective, and again, literature in this broad sense of literariness, so this will also include nonfiction, I recommend this ginormous book, A New History of French Literature, which is edited by Denis Ollier. And actually, I bought this from Amazon for like $8, so you should be able to find a pretty cheap version. And it's phenomenal. I mean, it begins with the Song of Roland in the 11th century and ends with like texts from the mid to late 20th century. And it really approaches these texts from a historical perspective, which is the approach that I take when it comes to the literature that I study. Again, much of it nonfiction, or predominantly nonfiction. So yes, that is my video today. Let me know what you found interesting in this section, and I will talk to you later. Bye now.